So exponential growth versus linear growth. What's the difference? In The Logic of Failure, author Dietrich Dorner introduces the idea of exponential growth, and he goes into quite a bit of detail about the difference between exponential growth and linear growth. And part of his point is that people have a very difficult time visualizing and conceptualizing exponential growth. He tells an interesting story to illustrate the point, so I'm gonna tell the story and then I'll give some definitions and then that'll be it. The story is a story of a person that invented the game of chess and presented it to the king whose court they worked in. As the story goes, the king was so impressed with the game that he told the inventor he could have anything that he wanted out of his treasury. Apparently, the king was very condescending, he was kind of rude, and he rubbed the inventor the wrong way. So the inventor decided to take advantage of the king's ignorance and ask for a reward that seemed very simple. So he pointed to the chessboard and he said all he wanted was some rice. He said he wanted 1 grain of rice for the first square on the chessboard, 2 grains of rice for the second square on the chessboard, 4 grains of rice for the third square, 8 grains of rice for the fourth square, and so on. I don't know how far he took that calculation out, but I'm assuming he didn't take it very far because, as the story goes, the king felt that he was getting off easy just providing some rice for this guy that invented this interesting game. So he called for a bowl of rice. They brought the rice out. They were looking at it in the chessboard, and pretty soon it became clear that it wasn't even almost enough rice to meet the need. So a mathematician got involved, but they calculated that there was no way the king was going to be able to meet this demand. Now, the number that Dorner tells us, the number of grains of rice that would have been on the last square, I have no idea what this number is. I'll put it on the screen. I'm sure there's plenty of you out there that know math better than I do, and you might know exactly what it is, but it's a lot. So, what I can tell you is he kind of translates this for plebeians like myself that do not get math. But he said just the rice from the very last square would be around 153 billion tons of rice. Putting that another way, if that rice was going to be transported, it would take 31 million cargo ships if each ship could transport 5,000 tons. That's just for the last square. The square before that would have been half that. That's still an astronomical sum. So we have exponential versus linear growth. Now, most people seem to view growth in a linear sense, and I'll put a graph on the screen to make that clear. But that seems to be how most people view growth. I know that as a strength coach, people, even when they're thinking about like building muscle and fat loss, they tend to think of it in a linear way. And I don't think things happen that way very often, but that's the way people tend to think of growth. So exponential growth, defining this, a quantity is said to be growing exponentially when its value at any time is its previous value multiplied by a particular number, and it has to be the same number each time. So in this case, with the chessboard, the multiple was 2. So we had 1 grain of rice times 2, 2 grains of rice times 4, 4 grains of rice, and so forth. It continues to double. The main difference between linear growth and exponential growth, just from a understanding it place, is that in linear growth, the quantity increases by the same amount, not by the same multiple. So linear growth tends to just look like a straight line. I'm not really sure how you would graph out exponential growth, but it wouldn't be a straight line. The last point on this before I get into my closing comments, in order for growth to be exponential, 2 things are required. This is important. One is that resources have to be available. If resources become depleted, exponential growth cannot continue. When you're thinking about that, the resource can be a lot of different things depending on the subject you're talking about. Just keep that in mind if you ever come across this term in life and you're trying to process it. When someone says that something is growing exponentially, it's only going to do that until whatever is being affected is can no longer be affected. I know that might sound vague, but if you ever hear someone use this term and you're trying to decide if they're using it correctly, it'll make sense. The second thing, the second qualifier is that the growth rate must remain constant over time for the growth to be considered exponential growth. That's also important because this is one of those terms that I think people will throw out there sometimes, and it's a big word and it sounds really official, and people won't always question it. So, which brings me to my closing comments. Why am I talking about this? One, it's from a book that I'm reviewing, so I just found it interesting and I thought I would share it. I have said before that math is not my superpower. This is very much related to math, so it's a little bit out of my scope. My scope is more in the mindset realm, but I found it interesting, so I'm sharing it. Another reason why I'm sharing it is because words are important. And I feel like this is communication is important. And I feel like this is one of those words that would be very easy for someone to get on television, an example, or on YouTube and throw it out there, maybe in a scary way, and not qualify what it means. I'm going to give you an example of a different time when someone used a word that people didn't understand, and sometimes, when I say people don't understand, when someone doesn't understand a word, that doesn't mean that they're ignorant or they're foolish. It just means they haven't heard the word. And there's no reason for you to hear about exponential growth unless you have unless you're like if you're into statistics or you're a mathematician, or if you read books or watch people who read books. I don't remember exactly when this happened. I think it was in the 1800s, and I don't remember the names of the politicians, but I think one of them was pretty well known. So I apologize to that. But I'm pretty sure in the 1800s there were two politicians running for office, and they were having a public debate. And one of the politicians was an actor, and another word for an actor is a thespian. I didn't know that until I heard this story, and I heard this story a long time ago, and this just stuck with me because it's really interesting because this is the way things work. So the other politician, they're having their debate. The other politician basically accused his opponent, um, and I don't remember exactly how I phrased it, but it was something along the lines of, "Do you admit that you are a practicing thespian?" Now, to the actor who was from an acting background, thespian means a real specific thing. It makes sense to him. There's no reason for him to necessarily like qualify it or define it. He just confirmed that he was in fact a practicing thespian. Apparently, from what I read, that was a weird enough thing and it freaked the audience out. And so he lost the election. That probably wasn't the only reason, but sometimes little things are contributing factors. And part of the point to all this, I know this is kind of a weird thing today, but part of the point to all this is when you hear a word and you're maybe not quite sure what it means, or if you're not positive it was used in the right context, go look that word up and think about it. It'll never hurt you to look a word up. Looking a word up just takes a couple seconds, and sometimes it'll help you put things in context, or maybe question something that you heard, because there are people who will try and gaslight anyone they can just by throwing something around that sounds technical. All right, so exponential growth. The lesson for today is if someone tells you they want a grain of rice for every square on the chessboard, negotiate a different deal. All right, go read a book.